Before we start the video off, thank you for 500 subscribers, and if you're not subscribed already, I would highly recommend you do that because I make content that's a little less serious than this and sometimes a little fun, so you should subscribe. All right, and let's get into the video.
Well, hi there.
I'm here today because I want to talk to you about this sort of ongoing debate about the morality of keeping spider ball pythons. Now, just as a forewarning, I'm not going to particularly take a stance on this issue and tell you whether or not I hate spider ball pythons or I hate people that keep them or I'm totally in support of them and I hate people that make opinion videos. I just think it's a very fascinating argument and sort of the debate itself is very interesting. So we're going to do this in a few parts. If you're not familiar with the controversy, I'll speedrun an explanation for you. Ball pythons are the most commonly bred species of pet snake and one of the most popular species of reptiles in the worldwide pet trade. Breeders produce ball python mutations that often result in different and really stunning patterns known as morphs, ranging from basic albinos to stunning Lucy's and mystic potions. Spider is a type of morph that produces a specific patterning but also commonly has neurological effects associated with it. Some of these neurological effects include the loss of balance, corkscrewing, and most commonly something known as wobble. Pretty much every single spider ball python has some degree of neurological issue, like minor wobble, but oftentimes this is not a threat to the animal's health. But sometimes it is. It's a subject matter that pretty much every major reptile YouTuber has covered and issued their sort of opinion on. And speaking of opinions, there's quite a few varying ones. I like to break these arguments and opinions down between keepers and breeders. You can think of it as sort of like a grassroots versus an establishment dichotomy. Whereas keepers are generally grassroots activists protesting the keeping of spider ball pythons. Breeders are more of the establishment that are like, hey, there's not really much of a problem with it. Now, this is not to say that keepers being grassroots activists have a moral superiority to breeders being the inherently evil establishment. This is far from true. We are assuming no moral superiority or ground to either of these sides. The keepers are usually people that just keep reptiles for fun. Someone like Go Herping or Wiccan's Wicked Reptiles. Say that 10 times fast. Whereas the breeders are, as the name implies, people that primarily make money off of breeding reptiles like the boys at Nerd or Brian Barczyk. And yes, you could argue that the Nerd boys and people like Brian Barczyk and Jay Brewer are both keepers and breeders. But I would argue that the breeder part of their reptile keeping identity is more salient or more dominant, and thus, even though they uphold both of these identities, they lean more in towards the breeder category. Now, when these two bicker back and forth, they like to bring in lots of different types of evidence to support their claims. These claims from the keepers primarily being we shouldn't keep spider ball pythons because these neurological defects cause them to suffer. Whereas the breeders say that we should keep spider ball pythons because neurological defects are common in various other animals such as dogs and etc. And also they don't really affect the well-being of the snake all that much. So on one hand, keeper evidence is almost entirely anecdotal, which means conclusions about the morality and well-being of spider ball pythons are drawn based on personal experiences or other individuals' accounts of those personal experiences, which means it's a pretty substantial lack of large data. If you go on YouTube and just look up spider ball python corkscrewing and you see 10 videos of a spider ball python going crazy, it can seem like pretty much every single spider is kind of messed up in that way, but that's not necessarily true. On the other hand, breeders have a much more substantial sample size to work with, making their data more accurate if they were to collect it. But these breeders also have an imperative to keep their business running. So if something was terribly wrong, or if this was morally incorrect, it wouldn't really be within their best interest to stop breeding spiders, because as we know, spiders are one of the most popular morphs of ball pythons, and they're incredibly profitable. So as I mentioned earlier, tons of different personalities in the reptile community have voiced their opinions about this issue, but today I want to specifically go over Clint's Reptiles opinion on the issue. Now, Clint is one of my favorite reptile YouTubers. He has this very sort of innocent and disarming personality, and the content that he makes is incredibly well produced and polished, in addition to it being incredibly informative and, you being there for his innocent charisma. He's a professor of biology at Brigham Young University and has made a number of expository videos simply talking about the genetics of ball pythons and spider ball pythons. I think Clint is in a very interesting position in the reptile community because he has a very unique appeal due to the nature of his videos and his personality overall. He's actually admitted to breeding a clutch of ball pythons to sell, but has also admitted to not making nearly any money off of it.
I have definitely spent more money on spider ball pythons by a long way than I have received from selling spider ball python. Terrible money. Spider ball pythons are a money sink for me.
But being a biologist and a scientist with a master's degree, he's very into these sort of facts don't care about your feelings arguments, which mostly run contrary to the keeper opinion of keeping spiders, which is in mostly of protest of keeping them, as we know. Clint claims he does not have a problem with the keeping and breeding of spider ball pythons, but I think that Clint's justification for why we should be allowed to keep spider ball pythons, and just his video writ large, is actually very interesting, informative, and kind of fascinating. I want to take the opportunity to sort of pick it apart and break it down and just isolate the most important parts of this video and criticize some of the things that I think he could have done better. Granted, I don't know nearly as much about genetics as he does, so that's not what I'm going to be criticizing. I'm going to be criticizing primarily the way that he approaches formulating his arguments using this evidence that all of us pretty much agree on. So let's watch it.
One thing that I've learned as a scientist is I am easily persuaded by evidence, not easily persuaded by emotional appeals. In fact, if the only argument that you can make is an emotional appeal, I think there's a pretty good chance you're not on the side of truth.
This is kind of an interestingly presented argument. Because he brings it up first, it's going to frame the rest of his arguments. Now, Clint doesn't say that all emotional arguments are bad. He says that if you're only able to make arguments from the emotional side of your psyche, then you're probably not on the side of truth, which is true and should be listened to, but it should be clarified that because he doesn't really do the best job of presenting this, it sounds like he's saying, oh, facts don't care about your feelings and all that kind of stuff. It should be clarified that emotions aren't always disqualifying when it comes to having an argument or making sound points. Your emotions and how the facts make you feel is how you begin to approach pretty much every topic that you may have an opinion on. Your emotions shape how you present these topics.
But there is also a very good argument to be made against breeding spider ball pythons. First is that all spider ball pythons everywhere have some degree of a neurological defect. Second, in some cases, that neurological defect can become debilitatingly severe. And third, choosing color or behavior over the health of the animal is morally wrong. Most of these things are true.
Clint acknowledges, at least in part, that these three things are true, which means that these three parameters are what the moral quandary will be over. It is now Clint and the viewer's job, that's us, to weigh the downsides and upsides of these 3 points in a sort of cost-benefit analysis, which is to say, do the benefits outweigh the harms?
This is Theo. He's my dog. He's defective in so many ways, and he wouldn't last a day in the wild. Like most domestic dogs, he's got floppy ears. And he's got a neurological disorder that is associated with those floppy ears. This neurological disorder, which causes him to be super laid back and happy-go-lucky, is either linked or pleiotropically related to the floppy ears. You can't have one without the other.
Do you see where he's going with this argument?
Spider ball pythons also have a mutation that causes both a phenotypic, well, a coloration alteration, and a behavioral defect, just like my dog.
No, not entirely. Once again, Clint and I are not disagreeing for the most part on the facts of this issue, but I don't think that this is a totally congruent or really fair comparison. Being the doctor of biology that he is, Clint is of course correct in saying that the physical expression of floppy dog ears is related to a calmer and friendlier disposition in dogs, just like the way that spider patterning is connected to neurological disorders in spider ball pythons. But to say that your dog's calm and friendly demeanor is on the same disadvantage level of a snake that can barely keep itself upright, and extreme cases can't even eat, is a bit of an exaggeration. I think a more apt comparison would be that of French bulldogs. Most of us can agree that Frenchies are adorable animals with short faces and stubby legs, but both of these physical traits come with their own health issues. Frenchies often have extremely difficult times breathing and often require surgery and attentive care from their owners just to respirate properly. This is an issue stemming from a phenotypic expression, which is what Clint uses to bolster his argument. Additionally, the short and stubby bodies that French bulldogs have contain extremely slim hips, which which makes natural reproduction impossible for these dogs, meaning that all Frenchies that are born from artificial insemination. I don't think that Clint is being purposely misleading with this argument, with this comparison, because technically my analogy doesn't fit 100% either, because ball pythons have a physical characteristic linked to a neurological issue, whereas these French bulldogs have physical characteristics linked to some other issues. But there are no shortage of examples and comparisons that can be made that are much more fair than that of just a dog being friendly being a neurological disorder.
A defect is an imperfection or something that alters the intended function. And this leads us to another really important question, which is, what does a perfect ball python look like? And what is the intended function of a ball python?
Clint's going to go pretty in-depth on this analogy later on in the video, so we're just going to reapproach this soon. Keep this in the back of your head for now.
This is a very teleological argument in that it assumes that there is a perfect intended form of a ball python.
Clint correctly points out that this is a teleological argument, but I think the unfair thing that he does is he claims that people that protest the keeping of spider ball pythons assume that there is some sort of perfect spider ball python out there, which is sort of an impossible burden for really anyone looking to make a point or have an opinion to uphold, which is kind of a sneaky straw man argument, but it's not the worst thing in the world.
Wild type of a peppered moth, and this is a mutant peppered moth. Now the question is, which one is perfect and which one's defective? After the start of the Industrial Revolution, trees near major cities were stained black. After this happened, we got to ask ourselves the question again. Which one is the perfect moth and which one's defective?
Clint insinuates that based on people that protest the keeping of spider ball pythons logic, that the black moth would be defective, similarly to spider ball pythons. Whether deliberately or not, Clint is misrepresenting the argument. The peppered moth was defective in a way that was sort of a forced adaptation to its environment. White moth that lives on trees covered in black ash, all of a sudden the moths that you're seeing survive the most are the ones with black on them. Forced adaptation, that's pretty much what evolution is. Spiders, on the other hand, is a trait that is selectively bred by humans, and when it does occur in the wild, these snakes simply die, rather than adaptively mutating like a lot of these moths.
While I'm not convinced that nature makes perfect organisms, which one is defective is hugely context dependent.
So this is where he sort of clears it up, but if you're watching the video and you miss this line, this example seems really, really ridiculous, because he's absolutely right about these examples being context dependent, which is why I think he used the peppered moth to begin with, because it's a really good example. But I think it needs to be said that more often than not, people that oppose the keeping of spider ball pythons don't claim that all animals with mutations or all animals with morphs are defective. Mutating and mutation is how evolution occurs. If an animal mutates in a way that puts it at a disadvantage, whether in the home or in the wild, it's more likely to die off, and that gene will not be passed down and reproduced, because nature understands now that it's not something that should be rewarded. But if that mutation is advantageous in the state of the peppered moth, it gets passed on and oftentimes ends up outcompeting the animal that it mutated from. That's evolution. That's why there's all these different species of crocodilians that all have very slight variations between them depending on the geography. And don't get it twisted, I'm not disagreeing with Clint here. In fact, I agree. I just believe that the way he's framed this argument can be sort of misleading for people, which is why I think this is one of his most disliked videos.
It's because they do really well in captivity. But there is a really important question, and that is, are they suffering? So how do we determine if they are suffering or not? One way would be to put yourself in their shoes. The problem is that you would hate to have almost no legs, live in a hole, and eat rats. You would be suffering if you were a ball python, but that doesn't mean that they are.
This concept is called anthropomorphizing, and Clint is absolutely right about this. I think that keeping pets is great for creating empathy within people, because if you take care of your pets properly, you're more likely to empathize and treat your fellow humans properly. There's lots of data to support this and the contrary. But anthropomorphizing is when people project human characteristics or human emotions onto their animal pets that do not possess them. Usually comes in the form of, oh, my lizard loves me, or oh, my frog likes being around me. That might be true of your dog sometimes, but it's definitely not true of your ball pythons or your lizards. I really hate to break it to you. That being said, snakes and other reptiles do experience stress in a manner that's kind of similar to humans. And because of this, there becomes this very fine line, which is why I think the debate about spider ball pythons has been allowed to persist as long as it has been. The stress is not the same stress that humans experience, as Clint explains.
The next way would be to look for typical signs of stress. Stressed snakes tend to exhibit a few behaviors that are very indicative of a stressed snake. Are there some stressed spider ball pythons out there? Yes, absolutely there are, for sure. Are there some stressed non-spider ball pythons out there? Yes, there are also stressed non-spider ball pythons. Are spider ball pythons more likely to be stressed than are non-spider ball pythons? This is an important question. And as far as I can tell from all the data I've observed, they're not.
I think the problem with this "there are stressed spiders, but there are also stressed normals" argument is that Clint draws an equivalency between stress factors in normal ball pythons and stress factors in spider ball pythons. He's right in assuming that yes, they can be exposed to the same stress factors like improper husbandry and incompetent keeping, but if a normal ball python is stressed or unhealthy, it's 100% the keeper's fault. Whereas even small slip-ups with spider ball pythons can exacerbate their condition much more. The argument that people who protest spider ball pythons make is that spiders are predisposed to having more stress due to their neurological disorders. So while Clint would probably be right in saying there are more stressed normal ball pythons and stressed spider ball pythons, simply because they're more out there, so the margin of error is much higher. And I think that's moving the goalpost of the argument a little bit, shifting it so it's harder to argue against, and thus it doesn't have much weight in this discussion. Clint even makes a point later in this video that we'll cover in a few minutes that insinuates people who don't take extra precaution with their spider ball python will end up with a snake that's much more unhealthy than a snake that they had, minorly screwed up with. And that creates the spider ball python, or the animal that has these sort of exaggerated problems. That means that even though the majority of spiders have neurological issues that never become a life-threatening or quality of life issue, they are inherently more predisposed to stress because those issues exist inside of them, which is part of the argument that most people against spider ball pythons make. And I think is something that a lot of breeders, establishment people, I guess, like Nerd, Clint, and Brian Barczyk, sort of fail to recognize. Clint's done the best job of highlighting it, and I think he sort of misses the mark on it.
My spider ball pythons are not any more restless than are my other snakes. I just took in a few as a rehoming.
No. That is a bad argument. Recall when I said that the majority of spider ball python dissenters rely purely on anecdotal evidence, which is exactly what Clint just used. If Clint gives that argument credence, Clint, it means you also have to give all these hundreds of other keepers with unhealthy ball pythons legitimacy as well, which is a ridiculous thing to do. I think that anecdotal evidence has its place in making an argument, but when you claim that you're against anecdotal evidence and then use anecdotal evidence, it sort of punches some holes in your argument. Whether or not we think anecdotal evidence is something that should be used is not something that I'm going to take a stance on. In fact, I just don't care. But if you're going to make these points, you should probably be more consistent about it.
Spider ball pythons are good breeders, and they're notoriously good feeders. And I don't think we have enough official data to conclude one way or another, but there definitely seems to be no sign that they feed worse than do other ball pythons. Potentially they feed much, much better.
What? First and foremost, Clint makes a claim and then says the evidence doesn't even support his claim, or there's not enough evidence to say for sure that his claim is true. It's not great form for claiming that you're on the side of truth using hard evidence. Secondly, I want to reaffirm that anecdotal evidence can be persuasive in some cases, like this one. And there are documented cases of spider ball pythons not being able to eat properly because of their wobble, sometimes even biting themselves and exhausting them to the point of where they can't even eat.
In fact, a couple weeks ago, he started eating himself. While he was going for the food, he completely missed, hit the ground, thought he ended up with the mouse in his mouth, but he didn't. So he went ahead and coiled up as if he was going to constrict the mouse. And so this poor spider ball python has his own teeth embedded in the side of his own stomach. He was really panicking. So after a few minutes, we were able to get his teeth unstuck. Thankfully, there was no blood or anything, but that's just an example of one of the weird things that has happened to him simply because he has a spider wobble.
But there certainly are some examples of spider ball pythons that exhibit a truly debilitating wobble. It seems possible that spider is a minimally different condition, generally speaking, that can be exacerbated by poor care.
This is what I said to watch out for. This is a really, really good point because it's like I said, predisposal. I think this is something that should definitely be researched, and I don't know who we can get to do that, but it's definitely something that we should look into in the future.
Would I recommend them to somebody who was aware of the wobble and ready for their first snake? Yeah, I totally would.
I think even beyond spider ball pythons, this is something that I think is really critical to take away from this video. Even if you don't have any intention of having a spider ball python, people will tell you about difficult reptiles and advanced level reptiles and beginner level reptiles. And I think a lot of that is true. You know, like leopard geckos are very simple to take care of, whereas abronia are much more difficult to take care of. But I think that so long as you know the risks and sort of issues associated with a lot of these animals, you should be ready to take care of it, which is to say that if you're prepared to give this spider ball python a good life, despite its wobble, you should be allowed to keep one. And I think that's a really interesting argument to stay consistent with his points that he makes.
Should breeders of spider ball pythons do more to inform their customers about wobble? I think so, absolutely.
I think this is one of the best parts of the video because even though Clint disagrees with the more popular opinion that his fan base seems to hold and what's more popular in the reptile community as a whole, he's still able to propose what I think is a logical solution to the issue without sort of drawing a huge divide like he did with some of the wordplay he was using earlier. Then he goes on a tangent about autism and sort of closes out the video. Now, look, this isn't all the information that you need to know about spider ball pythons. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out all these other videos and stuff that I use to research and sort of formulate my own points about it. But as I said, this video is not meant to be persuasive. If you've noticed, I sort of flip-flop back and forth between supporting people like Clint and supporting people that don't want ball pythons to be housed. Because I think that we'll probably be able to reach a better solution and find something that's much better for all the animals if everyone uses their arguments in good faith. For the most part, which Clint did, but I think that because he's such a big figure in the reptile community, and because he's a professor and has a master's in biology, people are going to take his opinion very seriously. And making sure that his arguments are up to par, I think is something that is critical for the community. If you're new here, by the way, you should subscribe. I make content that's less serious than this. I also make content with my reptiles that you can probably see in the room. So just hit subscribe and you can like the video as well. It helps me out and it means I get to keep making content. Also, for those that were already subscribed, sorry this video took so long. I really wanted to make it like super good. My initial plan was to break down Nerd's video, Brian Barczyk's video, Go Herping's video, and then just go through all of their arguments, but that would have been over an hour long. I just didn't want to like wait that long to put out a video like that. So I just chose my favorite video, which was Clint's, and decided to roll with it. Anyway, thanks for 500 subscribers. I'm really loving everyone that's loving the channel, so thank you super so much. And let me know what you want to see next.